Howdy folks. Today we're going to talk about React hooks. We're going to start off with two very common hooks, useState and useEffect. So we went over useState a little bit in the last video here, but didn't really explain what it does and how it works. So let's take a look at our labeled input here. And what I want to be able to do with this labeled input is possibly have the ability to check if it has any errors, right? And maybe I do a different state for errors. So if I start off, I can say, okay, error, set error equals useState. And what does this do? Let's break this down. So useState is what's called a hook. Hooks are various things that React provides, and you can write yourself, but they're basically things that run every single time your component renders, right? Because the function runs every time it renders. But their behavior changes based on how your component's set up. So for example, with useState is kind of almost like a memory lock. So whatever I put in here, my initial value to this function, that is the set value of the state. So the first time this hook runs, it's going to remember this value. Every time it runs after that, it's going to ignore what value I put in, and it's just going to give the value that I saved. So, for example, let me actually show you a better example of that. Let's make a component. Let's just make a symbol component here. React export default function component. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return a very simple button. Okay, button. All right, and then I'm going to put that in my app right above here. Let's get rid of, well, let's leave the forms for now. And if we start this up, let's take a look at what we get. That is, oh, I got React script starting. I got to let that run. Probably take a minute. Okay, there we go. Start development server. Page loads. Let's open up our inspector. I like to keep the inspector open all the time, just with the console open, just so I can kind of see what's going on. All right, click me. Okay. When I click this, well, nothing happens right now. What I want to do is I want to track how many times I've clicked it, right? So what I could do, I could say, yeah, clicks equals 0, and I could say clicked times, okay, and then I could add an event listener in here. It says on click clicks plus plus. Okay. So let's go ahead and go here, and let's console log our clicks as well. So I go here, okay, I click. Now you notice something in the console log here. It's saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But it's not updating here. The reason is because whenever I do this clicks here, nothing is telling React it needs to re-render the component. And if it doesn't re-render the component, none of this changes. Remember, that's kind of how React is set up. It re-renders the entire tree and merges the changes over. So you got to make sure it re-renders. So what I want is I want to do something that causes this to re-render. Well, that is actually something that useState does. So useState hook, it is an export of React. Okay. So I could pull it in like that. And so what it starts out, it gives you a list. And so if I give it 0, the default value, this list you generally destructure into two things. The first thing is the name of the state. So in this case, it's clicks. The second is a function that lets you update the state, set clicks. Because this is a array destructuring, you can name these whatever you want. You can name this blah if you want. It's just very common to name this set and then the name of the state, so it's very clear what it actually does, right? So now if I call set clicks plus 1, let's see what happens. And actually I'm going to put a console log here. Rendering component clicks state is clicks, just so we can kind of see what's happening. All right, So now, you notice it rendered twice here. Render component click state is 0. And that's the thing about React. It may render more times than you're expecting it to. So you can't assume that it's just going to render once on startup and then it's going to do a bunch of stuff. It may render more times. So let's clear that. Let's click this. What I'm expecting is that it should go to 1. And you can see rendering component click state is 1. It did it twice. So it re-rendered twice. And it updated here. That's okay. React is designed to very quickly do those renders, and if nothing changes, it's a very cheap operation to perform. But you can see when I click this and I call that set clicks, it overwrites that state variable, first of all, with clicks plus 1, but it also forces the component to re-render. And that's something that this hook is very useful for. Generally, that is the case with hooks. They hold on to data, and then you can have something that causes them to re-render, or they will keep that data across renders. So useState is basically a React-safe way of storing data. That data can be very complicated. You could have full nested objects in here. Set clicks only updates the full object. So if you really do have a very complicated object, you might want to either use a context or a Redux, which we'll get to at some point later. But for state, simple things like this, there it is. You have your variable, which starts at 0. So if I reload this, you can see it starts at 0. And then if I click it, what's going to happen is I'm going to set clicks with clicks plus 1. So it's going to set clicks to 1. The next time this runs, useState is still going to be called with 0, but React remembers that I've called this before. And so it remembers that clicks is not actually 0. It remembers it's 1 at that point because I've set it and I've changed it. So that's basically what that does. So in LabeledInput, we can use that to affect an error state. So if I say error set error equals useState false, what that does, that's creating a variable error, and it's creating a function to update that variable, and it's starting it off as false. Okay? So now I'm going to wrap this in a div here. And then I'm going to say, well, let's do this actually. Let's set the color, a background color of our input if there's an error. So styles are objects here. So I'm going to say background color. You notice also I'm not doing background dash color. When you do a style in React, React is smart enough to know that this needs to have a dash. So it handles that for us. So if there's an error, I want the background color to be red. Otherwise, I want it to be white. Oops, that's not red. Okay. So if I run this now, they're all white. Totally fine. That's completely fine. If I start off with my error as true, okay, they all go red. Pretty cool. So now, let's do this. Let's change this, handle this onChange event a little differently. Okay. And let me actually make this a little bit easier to read. So what I'm doing is I'm just putting all the properties on individual lines, so it's just a little bit easier to read them. So I still want to call bubble the handler, but what I want to do is I want the I want an empty to be an error state. So I'm going to say if e dot, well, let's value equals e dot target dot value. If value equals blank, then set error true. Else set error false. I could use a trinary for this as well. So now, if I type a little bit, as soon as it gets empty, it becomes red. So you can see this is a useful use of that state. Put that in there, red. So here's the thing though, I don't want that to necessarily be red as soon as I'm typing. Maybe I only want it to be red as soon as I blur the form. Okay. Well, in that case, I can grab my, I can change this to on blur. And then I can set this, well, let's just leave the on change in there. And then, okay, we'll reload this. Type I can go back to that. It won't go red until I blur. Okay. So there's another way that we can handle this though, because it'd be nice if I didn't have to keep all this logic in here. Because what if I wanted something else to change this error? Maybe I have like a value I'm passing in as well, and I want to handle that. So I want to pull this out of my blur, because yeah, maybe I want to put it in multiple places. I can do that by using useEffect. So first of all, I want to actually store this value, right? So I'm going to say, okay, const value, set value equals useState, and start off with blank, okay? Now I'm going to use this value as the value property of the input. Then I'm going to have my onChange function, e, and I'm going to say set value e.target.value. What's the point of that? Well, now I have this value. Every time I type, this value gets kind of propagated and saved. So now I can actually say, okay, rendering value is value. And I can type a bunch of stuff in here, type a bunch of stuff in here, and you can see I now have access to that value in the JavaScript, where before I didn't. This is not an uncommon thing in React to have just this value that's hooked up in this particular way. This is very useful so that you can actually have access to what the value is in your code, because otherwise it's kind of stuck inside that HTML. All right, so now let's talk about useEffect. useEffect is another hook that takes a callback as its argument, its first argument. So useEffect by default, let's do this, console.log rendering component or input, and console.log rendering useEffect. So by default, if I run this, you can see I get rendering input and rendering useEffect. This also happens 14 times for every time this happens here. useEffect by default, if you don't give it any second parameter, this function will run every single time the component renders. So if I go in here and I type, you can see it rendered the input and it rendered useEffect. It only renders useEffect a couple times, and the reason for that is this labeled input doesn't always fully render. All right, so useEffect can do a couple things. In this format, it's kind of useless because it basically runs every time the component renders, but we already have that. We could just put code here for that. If you give it parameters, which you want to give it an array of parameters, and you give it an empty array, it will only run once at the very beginning. So now, let me reload this. You can see we get this rendering useEffect, okay, 7.7, and then if I type here, you can see it doesn't show up again, even though the inputs get rendered. That's because useEffect, you give it a list of variables, and if any of the variables in that list change, the function is run. So if you give it an empty list, none of those variables can ever change, so it only runs once. This is a common pattern if you want something to happen only once when you first load the component. So let's say I want to do something whenever the value changes. I just put value in here. Okay, so I can say value changed. All right, rendering input. Get rid of that. Now, first of all, you notice value changed fires because useEffect always runs once. And this is important because the first time it runs, it doesn't know if this value is different from the previous value because it doesn't have a previous value. So it always runs one time. But after this, let's say I go in here, okay, and I change my value. You notice it only fires once. Change, 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 change. But none of the other useEffects on the other components are firing. The reason is because their values are not changing. Right? And actually let's put in let's just put in the name so it can be more clear what is changing here. All right? Why is that undefined? I guess the name is undefined. Oh yeah, that's probably why. So anyway, we won't worry about that. If the value changed, now we can actually say, okay, let's take our set error here, right? And let's pull that out and let's take a look at it here. You know, assuming it actually copies it properly. Now we can say, oh, if the value is blank, we set the error to true. If the value is not blank, we set the error to false. Now this will cause something interesting to happen. Because this function always runs once, the first time it runs, it will actually go through here. The starting value is blank, which means it'll set the error to true. And you can see now, when the page loads, all the errors start out as true. Maybe what you want, maybe what you're not. And then as soon as I type, it goes away, but it hasn't pushed up yet. So this is a way that you can handle this state as well. What we had in here with the on change or on blur was fine. But this is the more common way of handling state change based on variables changing. You could do this with props too. So like if you want something like maybe the label changes, you want to do something. That is totally a thing you can do. But yeah, so this is useEffect. You put something in here, you put the value in here, and this function is only called when that value changes. You can call set inside here. That's totally fine. That will cause another re-render, but that's completely okay. React is fine with that. This is a very common pattern for making state change based on other state. So the reason is, let's say I have my on blur down here, it's changing, or on change, it's setting my value, right? Maybe I have somewhere else in my code that also sets a value, if this is a complicated component, and I forget to run this error checking code. Well, then the error won't get set properly. But with this useEffect, it doesn't care where I'm setting the value. This is almost like an event handler. It's saying, hey, I want to listen to this value, and whenever it's, or this variable, and whenever its value changes, I want to run this code. So in that case, it doesn't matter where set value happens. Wherever it happens, the next time that render occurs, the useEffect hook is going to be called. So that is useState and useEffect. useState is a very common hook for holding on to data. The reason we use it like this is because, one, this function gets called a lot. It gets called every time we render, so any value we put in here is temporary. useState is permanent. The other reason we use it is this set function that comes out of it is the second parameter. Whenever we call that function to update the value, it is going to cause the component to re-render. That is really important because unless the component re-renders, none of this data changes. None of it. So if I have my value here and I'm not calling set value, I'm just modifying value directly, nothing will change. So the useState is a way of not only storing a variable, but also notifying your component that it should re-render itself and go through that whole process when that value updates. Then we have useEffect. useEffect with an empty array runs once when the component is first created and never again. If you pass a value into it, so any variable, it runs once when the component is created, and then afterwards every single time that variable is updated. And you can chain these too. So I can have a useEffect that like goes off of error. And so what would happen is LabeledInput would render. I would change the value. It would run both of these. At that point, value has changed. Error has not changed. So it runs this code, which causes another render cycle. And then this effect triggers because error has changed, but value has not changed. So this one won't run. It can be kind of confusing to figure that out. But that's basically how it works. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you all next time.